When the Iranian government cuts the internet, that's not a good sign. They pulled this exact move back in 2019 after they killed around 1,500 protesters over 2 weeks. Then again in 2022 during the Mahsa Amini uprising. Each time, the blackout served the very same purpose: to hide what's happening from the outside world and their own citizens until the immediate threat from the protests subsided. So when the internet connectivity cut off across the nation earlier this month, it was pretty clear what was coming, especially given it happened after weeks of the largest sustained protests since the 1979 revolution. But what happened next shocked even the most pessimistic Iran observers. You've probably seen the shaky videos that made it out despite the crackdown. Images of uniformed men striding down the street, firing again and again, of snipers on rooftops, blurry images of bodies piled in corridors. While the ongoing blackout makes getting reliable information tricky, enough has leaked out to give us a clearer sense of the horrors unleashed across January the 8th and 9th. Horrors that may have culminated in one of the largest mass killings in recent history. If a recent report in Time is to be believed, 30,000 may have died. And it's our task today to try and figure out if that's an overcount or a glimpse into the deadliest crackdown in modern history: the blackout. Now, before we start discussing the potential death toll from Iran's protests, we need to make one thing clear. Getting even a rough estimate of the body count is vastly more difficult than in other contexts, such as the Ukraine war, where information is able to flow freely in and out of the country. The regime in Tehran has learned over the years that controlling information about atrocities might be even more important to their survival than the actual massacres themselves. Hence the massive investment in infrastructure designed to facilitate a complete communications shutdown. Iran developed its own domestic intranet with the help of Chinese tech firms like Huawei, which gives the regime the capability to sever the country from the global internet while maintaining internal communications for government use. The regime deployed partial versions during the 2019 and 2022 protests, blackouts that proved relatively easy to bypass. Fast forward to early 2026 when protests were spiraling out of control. On January the 8th, 2026, the regime flipped their version of the kill switch, and within hours, total connectivity throughout the country collapsed to just 2% of normal levels. This blackout was far more expansive than just home Wi-Fi networks. It extended to disabling phone lines and SMS services in protest strongholds. As such, it has been near impossible to say what is going on in the country with anything like accuracy, something that will be reflected as we discuss different potential death tolls in today's video. With information so limited, different rights groups and monitors face tough decisions about how best to calculate a likely total of those killed. The only thing we can say with absolute conviction is that the regime's crackdown was brutal in the extreme. According to New York Times reporting, citing 2 Iranian officials briefed on the directive, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei ordered the Supreme National Security Council to crush the protests, quote, by any means necessary. Security forces were told to shoot and kill, leading to instances of soldiers opening fire on crowds with live ammunition. In some cities, heavy weaponry even seems to have been deployed, with eyewitnesses in Karaj describing security forces using anti-aircraft machine guns to mow down protesters. The killing was largely, but not entirely, concentrated into roughly 48 hours of peak violence, and by the time that it was over, the protests had mostly been crushed. Analysts tracking the situation recorded 156 protests across 27 provinces on January the 8th. Just 4 days later, that number had dropped to just 7. Now, while WarFronts can't independently verify that there weren't any protests anywhere in the country, the impact was clearly transformative. For days after the shooting, regime forces worked round the clock to keep that level of fear running through the country. Witnesses described Basij militia on motorbikes patrolling neighborhoods in the aftermath, shouting, "Don't come out, we'll shoot you." At the same time, though, the government was working to ensure that news of this massacre didn't reach the wider world. When Starlink waived subscription fees for users in Iran, for example, the authorities deployed large-scale GPS jamming to block out the majority of satellite connections, while also sending security forces to carry out door-to-door raids using drones and radio frequency scanners to locate dishes. For those outside the country trying to figure out what had happened, this presented a major problem. One that's the exact opposite of the battlefields in Ukraine, where too much information flooding out can make sorting the truth from the propaganda difficult. Yet for all the heavy-handed tactics, the Iranian regime couldn't completely cut off the country. Little by little, witnesses like doctors and medical teams, as well as extremely brave activists, managed to get videos and images out to the world. And it's thanks to their work that we're now able to at least try and evaluate a possible death toll. And just before we get into the grim work of counting Iran's dead, a quick breather to tell you about our subscriber service. Front.co is where we go deeper into the news, digging down further than we could ever hope to here on the main channel. In the last couple of weeks, for example, we've covered what life is really like for those protesters imprisoned by the Iranian regime, as well as a geostrategic analysis of what it would mean for Tehran's allies like Russia should the Ayatollah fall. Iran, obviously, isn't all we cover. We have episodes also dedicated to the war in Sudan, to Ukraine, and a whole lot more, plus our weekly roundup of the most overlooked conflict stories. For $5 a month, you get exclusive access to 2 videos a week, as well as articles written by our stabled analysts. That's Fronts.co, and now back to the true toll of Iran's bloody crackdown. The numbers. Since we have to start somewhere, we might as well begin with the lowest official account out there, that of the regime itself, with claims that 3,117 people died during the unrest, a figure announced on January the 21st as part of their final report into the incident. Now, this is likely a deliberate undercount, but even so, the number is quite significant. It exceeds the total official toll given for the 2019 and 2022 crackdowns combined. By the government's own admission, this is already the deadliest episode in the Islamic Republic's 47-year history. Interestingly, their statements haven't been able to maintain internal consistency with each other, which offer some interesting insights all their own. Sources close to the Supreme National Security Council, the Presidential Office, and the IRGC, for example, told anti-regime media the protester death count was at least 12,000. That is 4 times higher than the figure given in the so-called final report. Nor does the breakdown of totals in the report make much sense. 2,427 innocent civilians and security personnel killed versus just 690 protesters. That would imply that people armed with sticks and stones were able to kill men armed with military-grade weapons, maybe even anti-aircraft guns, on a vast scale. That officials inside the regime would leak such dramatically higher figures suggests genuine disaffection with the brutality of the crackdown. But it's an open question as to how true even this figure of 12,000 dead really is. So if the government's numbers don't hold together, what do we actually know? Well, we'll level with you. The other reports range all over the place, depending on how they're measured and who you ask. At the more conservative level, there are organizations like the Human Rights Activists News Agency, or HRANA. After nearly being destroyed back in 2010 because of a government mass arrest of their members, they completely rebuilt themselves and today have the largest volunteer network inside Iran of any human rights group. They are the gold standard. But they're also extremely thorough in terms of building a verification standard requiring 2 separate independent sources to record a death. Family confirmation plus hospital records are the most common too, but it can also include photographs of graves or multiple eyewitness accounts. If an alleged killing doesn't meet this threshold, it's not counted. As of their last update, prior to recording on January the 27th, the verified total stood at 6,221, broken down into 5,858 protesters, 214 security personnel, 49 bystanders, and 100 children. They also have an additional list of 17,091 deaths categorized as under investigation. Cases are reported through their networks that don't yet meet their verification threshold. When you combine confirmed deaths with those under investigation, you get approximately 23,000. Now, it's unlikely that every single one of those 17,091 pending cases will make it to their list. But again, their methodology is to have a rock-solid list that verifies beyond any reasonable doubt that if someone is on it, they were a real person who really was killed. By definition, this system is built with the understanding that it is going to miss some victims. The Sunday Times, for its part, did some excellent reporting with a secret network of doctors inside Iran and arrived at an estimate of 16,500 to 18,000 deaths based on hospital data and eyewitness accounts, lower than the potential total from HRANA, but still an order of magnitude above the regime's official final count. And then there's the Time magazine report that we opened today's episode with. Put together through on-the-ground sources led by 2 senior health ministry officials who spoke directly to Times reporters, the story described internal government counts that surpassed 30,000 dead for January 8th and 9th alone. Their evidence was consistent with mass casualty events, the likes of which Iran has never seen. Individual facilities were completely overwhelmed, like the single Tehran morgue that reported between 700 to 1,000 bodies. One Iranian doctor who spoke to Western media on the condition of anonymity described the situation simply as urban warfare. As a second separate part of Time's investigation, a German-Iranian surgeon named Dr. Amir Parasta compiled an independent tally of hospital-registered deaths totaling 30,304. Parasta gathered his data through a network of doctors inside Iran in select cities, communicating largely through smuggled-in Starlink terminals, and he has been explicit about what that number doesn't capture. It includes only deaths registered at civilian hospitals, which means it necessarily excludes military medical facilities, bodies taken directly to morgues without hospital processing, and deaths in areas where no information escaped at all. In short, by this assessment, 30,304 is an undercount. Time brought in Columbia University's Les Roberts, who is something of an expert on estimating mortality in conflict zones from Iraq to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Roberts' take? Quoting, 30,000 deaths are almost certainly an understatement. To put this in perspective, the bloody crackdown that followed Tanzania's election last autumn resulted in roughly 2,000 deaths. And that was considered a horrifying massacre. 30,000 deaths in 2 days? The only comparison point in recent history comes from an actual war zone, the fall of El Fasher in Sudan, where the RSF are thought to have slaughtered over 60,000 people in a single week. This isn't even the upper end of the death tolls that have surfaced in at least semi-reliable media. That goes as high as 36,500 as reported by Iran International, though we have to emphasize that theirs are anonymous sources citing documents and data that cannot be independently verified. The outlet has a history ranging from breaking really solid original reporting from inside the country to less than well-sourced claims, shall we say. They operate from London and are financed by Saudi Arabia to give you some insight into where they're coming from. So technically, the numbers of how many actually died span the regime's deeply unlikely count of 3,117 to figures north of 30,000, with most rigorous independent verification, that done by HRANA, landing somewhere around 6,000 confirmed and another 17,000 under investigation. But there's a reason that the death tolls vary so dramatically, and it has everything to do with how and where the killing actually took place. Who died? Now, before we get into the patterns of who was killed, it's worth addressing the elephant in the room. Should we trust any of these higher estimates, or are they inflated by opposition groups with an axe to grind? There's a historical precedent worth mentioning here, and it's not a particularly encouraging one if you're hoping that some of these figures may have been exaggerated by anti-regime protesters trying to drum up international support for intervention. Back in 2019, when the regime cracked down on the fuel protesters, a human rights organization using these same verification methods eventually documented somewhere between 300 and 320 deaths, which was the number that got cited in international discussions for months. That is, until Reuters got their hands on leaked Interior Ministry documents, the regime's own internal count of what actually went down. The actual toll was around 1,500, meaning the same type of sourcing had captured 20 to 25% of the real number. We're not going to extrapolate and start doing rough multiplication here of what that could mean, because each situation is different, and the on-the-ground reporting from human rights groups this time has come a long way since the 2019 protests. But it should at least signal that HRANA's final count is likelier to be an underestimate than an overestimate, perhaps by a wide margin. The patterns in who actually died tell us something about how the crackdown was conducted too, not just in terms of its scale. Kermanshah province, for instance, reportedly saw around 700 people killed in those 2 nights of January the 8th and the 9th. Kermanshah is overwhelmingly Kurdish, and when you look at what units the regime deployed there, the picture starts to get darker. The IRGC sent their dedicated anti-Kurdish insurgency unit, the same force they used to fight separatist militants in the border regions, along with an elite special forces brigade that had previously helped crush protests in Tehran during the 2022 protests. This should be viewed as less of a police response and more of a deliberate escalation given the long-standing tensions with the Kurdish minority there. The Kurds weren't alone in bearing the brunt of this either. On the opposite side of the country, in the southeastern province of Sistan Balochistan, another ethnic minority faced almost identical heavy-handed treatment from the outset of the protests. Like the Kurds, the bloc are concentrated in the border regions with long histories of rocky relations, shall we say, with the Persian-dominated central government. When the regime decided the protests had to end, these were the first communities to feel the crackdown. There's another pattern worth noting here too, one that helps explain why the verified counts currently seem on the low side. Eyewitnesses in multiple cities reported encountering security forces who didn't speak Persian at all. In Karaj, witnesses described units using heavy machine guns whose commanders were speaking Arabic, some of whom were reportedly photographing themselves with piles of bodies. CNN reported that an Iraqi security source informed them that nearly 5,000 Iraqi Shia militia fighters had crossed into Iran to assist with the crackdown, some of whom entered through border crossings under the guise of religious pilgrimages. The logic here isn't hard to follow. Foreign fighters don't have neighbors or cousins in the crowds, so there's no reason to hesitate when the order comes. But it also has implications for the death toll question. The Kurdish and Baloch regions that bore the brunt of this violence were also under the most complete information blackout. Analysts noted that Kurdistan province was essentially dark. Any reliable numbers from there will only surface much later, if they surface at all. Where next? So where's this leave us? We'd love to be able to give you a number. We'd love to say that we are at WarFronts were able to extrapolate or investigate our way to confidence that X amount of people were killed so far at the hands of the regime. But, truth be told, there is just so much uncertainty in this situation given how difficult it is to get data passed around inside the country, let alone smuggle it out. The estimates that put the death toll at or above 30,000 were initially met in the international community with some skepticism. And that skepticism can be healthy, given that opposition movements have a vested interest in making whatever government they're protesting look as evil as they can. That said, we have to be cautious downplaying to what extent the Ayatollah and his men are willing to go to in order to cling to power. For decades now, the Islamic Republic has presented itself as perennially under attack from abroad, creating a securitized society in which criticism of the regime is inherently criticism of the Iranian nation, and by extension, the Iranian people. So far, they haven't shown any indication of fracturing over the fallout from the crackdown. As we covered over on our sister channel HomeFronts, there have been leaks that senior members of the regime are considering reforms to both Tehran's domestic and foreign policy if the US holds off intervening. But this is almost certainly exaggerated leverage to stay in power rather than being driven by any genuine desire for reform. The entire political leadership has backed the crackdown, from President Pezeshkian's public statements to Foreign Minister Saeed Abbas Araghchi's recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which was ominously subtitled, "Unlike the restraint we showed in 2025, this time we'll have no qualms about firing back with all we have." Whether or not the regime stays in power is yet to be determined, but whether the true death toll is closer to 6,000 or 36,000, the message would still be the same. Even if we take the low-end estimates, the regime just carried out one of the bloodiest crackdowns in modern history, one that dwarfs the harsh repression unleashed in Venezuela, Nepal, or Tanzania following contested elections. At the higher end, Tehran just oversaw a crackdown close in scale to Saddam Hussein's whole-scale massacre of communities that rose up against Israel in 1991. The fact that we're having to go back 35 years to get a suitable comparison point, or turn to the atrocities carried out by the RSF in al-Fasher, should tell you all you need to know about what the regime's message was meant to be. A warning to its own people that we're here, we're not going anywhere, and we'll do anything to stay in power. How the international community responds to this will doubtlessly be the subject of many episodes to come. Thank you for watching.